The creation of media is often one with the goal of making a franchise. Everything from movies to shows to games usually ends up crossing over with each other as dollar signs appear in the eyes of the creators, merchandisers, and shareholders in charge of any one property. But when it comes to making movies into cartoons, there are a few odd choices that honestly just don't make sense, or you question why it was being made into a cartoon in the first place. And while this is something I'm not going to be doing constantly, today we're going to be doing the top 10 movies that shouldn't have become cartoons, but did. Yes, I know it's not the most snappy of names, but saying things like adult films that became kid cartoons doesn't sound right at all, and the connotations it carries are, yeah, let's just get off that subject. But to explain the subject of this top 10 properly, every movie on this list is one that is clearly not designed for kids in mind, having things like swearing, sexuality, and visible on-screen violence, but eventually got a cartoon to go off the popularity of that movie. Now, keep in mind that this is not about the quality of the movies or the cartoons themselves. Most of these are all good their own ways. This is just about how much content of the movie was designed for adults and yet still got turned into a kid's cartoon. With that all said, let's get to the countdown itself. Number 10. The Mask. Out of everything that we've got on this list, The Mask is perhaps the one movie turned into a cartoon that actually makes the most sense given the context of the film. The titular character himself draws from the main character Stanley and his love of cartoons and animation, most notably Tex Avery cartoons like Red Hot Riding Hood, and because of that, we have the magic empowering him being full of wacky powers and things, well, that are seen straight out of cartoons. So being made into an actual kid's cartoon actually makes a lot of sense when viewed from that standpoint, until you have actually watched the movie again. Then you remember things like the Mask's first mission in the movie being to shove up car parts into two mechanics that had cheated Stanley, the constant shooting of characters without the cartoon immunity of said Mask, and a half-a-minute-long objectification of the main female lead character. Yeah, this was clearly designed with an older audience in mind. That said, the cartoon itself was actually pretty decent, though it made the Mask a bit more of a chaotic good character than his striking back at everyone who wronged him personality that he had in the film. In many ways, you could say this cartoon is a big brother to Freakazoid, considering it came a full month before the internet hero. But overall, The Mask is probably the tamest thing on this list, and as such, let's get onto something a little bit more decapitating. Number 9. Highlander. So, I'm going to be 100% honest. There are two particular movies on this list that I've honestly never seen myself personally, and Highlander is one of them. I don't really know much about the cartoon or the movie itself outside of what I've heard, so what I do know, though, is the basic premise, basically being about a group of beings who are immortal and who are fighting to obtain the power of all immortals. To do that, they have to fight each other and attempt to kill each other through the only way they can kill an immortal, by decapitating them. So yeah, when that's the basis of your entire movie and you're slicing off the heads of others to take their powers, that's not exactly something that I would call kid-friendly. Which makes it all the more surprising that the cartoon itself continues with just that. Yeah, beheading still happens in the Highlander cartoon, though from what I've read, the show itself is an alternate universe take on the movie proper. Regardless, for that and other elements to still be around in its era of cartoons, it's more than a little surprising to see. Number 8. Osmosis Jones. Another movie that makes sense to be a cartoon on paper, considering half the movie itself is animated to show off the insides of Frank. Osmosis Jones is something that even the most casual of fans would know. It's a weird choice to transition from movie into cartoon. Filled with gross-out humor from the likes of projectile vomiting and zit popping, the amount of stomach-turning stuff they actually show in the film wouldn't get into anything that wasn't named Ren and Stimpy, and even then, there are a few things that the show wouldn't touch before it went over to its adult variant. Even with that though, the cartoon actually pulled out a lot of interesting ideas that either went unexplored or didn't get developed enough in the actual movie. And while Ozzy and Drix went and pretty much ignored everything that came from the original movie, barring its two main leads, it was still able to offer an interesting look into things that happened within the human body with a cartoony spin. Number 7. James Bond. Okay, so this one is a bit weird, and not because it's James Bond and that's kind of obvious on just how mature those movies can be, what with it being about a romanticized life of an international spy. No, it's actually how they transitioned it over into a cartoon. Instead of doing a one-to-one translation or a semi-sequel like most of the other cartoons on this list do, we instead focus on a next generation for the James Bond characters, where all the characters are kids that are related in some way, shape, or form to the original counterparts. Basically think what Tiny Toons did, but nowhere near as well done. I was honestly never that big into James Bond myself, but anyone with a passing familiarity with the spy would know that making a cartoon aimed at kids is just kinda weird. Also, why is Bond's nephew known as James Bond Jr.? Can somebody answer me that? Number 6. Ghostbusters. Starting things... Wait, what the heck?
Hi, sweetie!
Gah! Jeez, hun, you scared the hell out of me.
Sorry, hun, but I had to. Mind letting an actual Ghostbusters fan take this one?
Yeah, sure. Be my guest.
Thanks. While the film itself is rated PG and most of its scenery and effects are generally superficial and harmless, the film contains a few legitimate scares that kids might find jarring, a result of the practical effects work adding to the realism. Seriously, those damn terror dogs still scare the crap out of me. Plus, the movie contains several instances of mild swearing, such as damn, shit, and bitch, as well as scenes of both physical and magical violence, lewd humor, and allusions to sex and alcohol. While the first episode of the cartoon actually tied itself into the movie by basically picking up where it left off story-wise, the look of the costumes was changed and the main characters were made to look different from their respective actors. The cartoon itself actually gained quite a following and lasted for 5 years, spawning multiple toy lines and also popularizing the Green Ghost Slimer as a mascot. Strangely enough, the cartoon wasn't as kiddie as some think either, with some of the monster and ghost designs being outlandish and sometimes disgusting. Even some of the stories themselves were a bit iffy and scary considering their target audience. Even so, both the movies and cartoon series maintain a large fan base to this day.
Number 5. Beetlejuice. From the Ghostbusters to the Ghost with the Most, Beetlejuice is both a movie and cartoon on this list that I'm actually the most knowledgeable about, having grown up with both. But our focus here is just how mature the movie was, and, well, there's actually a lot in here that I'm kind of surprised got through on a movie that's actually rated PG. Not only is the subject matter something that is kind of up there, with death and the afterlife being the major focus of the film, but then you get instances like Beetlejuice out and out killing some characters, even if it's in a over-the-top and cartoony way. Add in the fact that the title character has a bunch of gross-out humor and actually flat-out visits a strip club in one scene, and yeah, it's not exactly a kid film. Which makes it all the more surprising that they not only turned it into a cartoon, but were able to keep a lot of aspects that made the movie what it is, while also making it more aimed at children, having some of the more gross out humor being things that were either never directly seen on screen, or always just off in a distance where you could hear sound effects. They do make Beetlejuice more of a chaotic good character than the clearly evil spirit that he is in the film, focus instead on him mostly doing things for his own entertainment or to get rich quick. He's otherwise written to be adoring Lydia to the point where she's the one person who's able to rein him in and keep him under control. It's a good show, but I still question why they made it in the first place, considering the source material. Number 4. Evolution. We're getting into the big ones now, folks, and if it wasn't for just how out there the top 3 were, Evolution probably would have actually made it into one of those slots. As it stands, though, Evolution is a very weird movie. Originally written as a horror film that then got turned into a comedy, the amount of jump scares and just gross out humor alone is honestly something that you would think would be enough to ensure that this never got made into a cartoon. I mean, the ending of the film has the character sticking a hose up what looks like to be the butthole of the monster to lather it into stuff that would kill it. Not exactly something you want the 10 and under crowd to be seeing. And yet, we got the entire series that followed up afterwards, complete with the adorable little mascot to represent the franchise. This doesn't make sense to me in the slightest on why they thought this would make a good cartoon. I honestly can't say anything about the show itself, having never really seen it, but from what I've read up about it, it's nowhere near as out there as the movie. Number 3, Rambo. Okay, how much do I really need to go on about how the Rambo movie isn't for kids? I think this one is a bit self-explanatory, but to give it its due, the first Rambo film isn't a lighthearted romp or the male-empowered fantasy some of the later films are. It's a showing of just how post-traumatic stress disorder and what it can do to a man, especially when it's caused by something as harmful as a war. We see the main character Rambo himself get thrown into situations not of his own choosing and end up being harassed and chased after like a criminal just for what he is. But even with that aspect in mind, he later becomes a gun-toting, explosion-cunning, jacked-up superhero, and none of this really screams kid cartoon. And yet we got Rambo: The Forces of Freedom, which, let's be entirely honest, was kinda there as a G.I. Joe ripoff. It involved characters from the first 2 films, so it draws a lot of elements that would be common when this movie became a franchise, but let's just call a spade and move on. Number 2, The Toxic Avenger. So, remember how I said there was another movie on this list that I know nothing about other than Highlander? Yeah, Toxic Avenger is this, so I apologize for not really being able to supply much information about it. What I can tell you is that this movie got a hard R rating back in the 80s, and while it's widely agreed that children are a little bit more used to things like violence and whatnot as the years have passed, and things that would have gotten a hard R back then might be a little bit less biting now, there's still a lot about this movie that is kind of things that you wouldn't want a kid to be watching, like a villain's eyes being gouged out, or a woman pleasuring herself topless while on screen. That's not even mentioning the fact that the main character's whole deal is him falling into a vat of acid to become the titular character. And yet they made a cartoon of it. Like, how? Why? Was there really that much of a call for it? Or was there another element of dark humor that this franchise actually loved to swim in to make it into a cartoon? I don't know, and I honestly think I might be better off not knowing. And the number 1 movie that got turned into a cartoon but really shouldn't have is Robocop. Out of all the movies that we have talked about on this list, they've all had elements of violence, sexuality, death, and whatnot to really build themselves up into something that you wouldn't think would transition over into a cartoon fairly easily. Robocop gets the number 1 spot by not only having all of these elements in spades throughout the entire franchise, much less the first movie, but also by the simple fact that it didn't just got turned into 1 cartoon, it got turned into 2. And this is them doing that about a man who was violently shot, on screen mind you, to the point where they legitimately had to put him back together with robot parts. Add in things like Robocop opening up the throat of one of the main characters by stabbing them, and the whole concept that is the It's Not My Problem a TV show that's in universes being popular, and yeah, this was not a kid's film in the slightest. And yet they marketed a lot of this stuff from it to kids, selling toys of things like Ed 209 and the main character's firearms, and generally as much as they could with the popularity of robots during that era of television. I honestly think that's why it got turned into a cartoon, because they saw the likes of Transformers and wanted a bit of that pie. Either way, the movie was not made for kids in the slightest, regardless of its marketing, and that's more than enough to rank it as the number one. And that's the list, folks. I hope you've all enjoyed it, since it was a bit of fun to look at the movies and shows I both knew and didn't to make this list. Is there anything on this list that you agree with? Is there any that you don't? Would you put different movies on here? I'm curious. Please tell me your thoughts. Until then, I'm going to be working on a script of something else I think a lot of you want to see me talk more about, and we'll see you next week.